welcome to Larry the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, another in my series of heavy thoughts. This is where I take a moment to share with you what's been on my mind lately. And what's been on my mind lately is why does it feel like hair metal hasn't aged very well? And what got me thinking about this is that I've been reading a book on the history of hair metal. I'll do a video on it at some point. So I've been listening to a lot of that kind of stuff. Now, did a whole video on the whole term hair metal. Yeah, I know it's kind of derogatory and everything, but for better or for worse, it's sort of the most used term for this type of music. To be more kinder to it, you could say LA metal, you could say melodic heavy metal, but it's all basically the same thing. And like I said, the hair metal expression is what's used most commonly when referring to this type of stuff, which is this melodic heavy metal that came out right around 82, 83 and went through the 80s till like 90, 91, mostly coming out of LA, which was sort of the epicenter for this, although there were bands from other places. But as I was reading the book, I've been listening to a lot of these bands, and I sort of thought to myself, you know, why has this stuff not aged particularly well? It doesn't have quite the timeless classic feel to it, for me at least, that like stuff like Led Zeppelin or Thin Lizzy or UFO or a lot of the great bands from the 70s, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, that those bands have. And it really got me thinking of why is that? Well, the first reason for me at least, and I'm sure for a lot of people, is the look. And for me, that's the most obvious thing. Even the name hair metal is sort of mocking the over-the-top fashion. And it's not like, you know, guys in rock bands didn't dress crazy and weird or stuff that was, you know, you think about the people in the 70s, you know, they wore stuff that was very much in at that time and everything. But the whole hair metal look, the spandex, the big hair and all that, it's aged very poorly. And for a lot of bands, like here's Cinderella, and I've talked about how much I like Cinderella, and I've talked about how this did them a disservice, in my opinion. You know, the name of the band, just the way the lettering is and the way the guys looked and everything. You know, they were a great bluesy, hard rock, Stonesy, AC/DC kind of band, but they got really trapped inside this image, and a lot of bands got trapped inside the image. I mean, I remember I never liked Twisted Sister's look. There was never a point in time where I thought that looked cool. I always thought that looked bad, and it's a shame because, like, you know, if you look at the picture on the back here, they look really, really cool just in, you know, leather and, you know, denim. You know, here they are just in denim here, you know, jean jackets and stuff like that. And they look really, really cool. And if they had maybe gone with this type of look, it might have, I don't know, you know, maybe it would have helped. But this, to me, it just looks really dated. It looks kind of silly. And to this day, you have to sort of look past it and just get into the music, which is what I do. But I can understand why this sort of hangs like an albatross over the head on the neck of, you know, many of these bands from that era. It just flat out has not aged well. And another thing, again, as I was reading this book, I went and I made a playlist. I have Apple Music now, and I made a playlist of my favorite hair metal albums. And I was sort of surprised at how few good albums, a lot of these bands put out. Now, of course, what's good is subjective, but let's take Twisted Sister. You know, Under the Blade, You Can't Stop Rock and Roll, Stay Hungry. And then they really took a big step backwards, Come Out and Play, Love Is for Suckers, and then they broke up. You know, they had 5 albums, really, in my opinion. Only 3 of them are good, and the last 2 are not very good. Quiet Riot, I love the first Quiet Riot album. I love the second Quiet Riot album, but then Quiet Riot 3, it took a big drop for me, and then they just sort of fell off the map. Some bands were able to have a little bit more albums, like for instance Dokken. You've got Breaking the Chains, Tooth and Nail, Under the Attack, or Back for the Attack. I forgot. I know I'm missing one in there. But so they had like 4 like albums and then they broke up. A lot of these bands didn't put out a lot of albums. It's not like Led Zeppelin, 8, 9 records. Sabbath, 8 records in the 70s. You know, the Dio era albums where they had these longer careers. UFO, Thin Lizzy, Uriah Heep, Deep Purple. They all put out a lot of albums. A lot of these hair metal bands, they only had a couple albums before they broke up, especially if they were sort of late towards the later part of this era, the Warrants and the Wingers and stuff like that. They only managed to get out, you know, maybe 2 or 3 records before they broke up. And even again, a lot of the bigger bands, Motley Crue, you know, I really like Motley Crue, but you've got Too Fast for Love, Shout at the Devil, Theater of Pain, Girls, 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 Dr. Feelgood. And then Vince Neil leaves. I really like the self-titled album, but that only gives us 6, you know, and they're one of the biggest bands from this era, one of the bands to have the most long career. You know, Cinderella had 3 records, then they broke up. You know, just a lot of those bands were like that. They only had a couple records, or they only had a couple good records. Rat, they seemed to hang in there and have a lot of good albums. They're sort of like Motley Crue for me, but a lot of them just had a couple of good records and then they broke up, or they just really, you know, kind of fell off then the quality of their music took a long drop. So they didn't have particularly long careers, and I don't think that has helped with the legacy of this type of music. All right, and then number 3 is just the sudden arrival of grunge. And now I've done videos on this one not that long ago with my friend Matthias, where we talked about the impact of grunge in Europe and everything, and I talked a little bit about it here. But it really felt like it happened overnight. And this has happened to rock and roll in the past. I mean, punk showed up in the 70s, and that sort of reduced some of the sales for some of the the early 70s bands, new wave and everything. You know, there's disco, there were always things coming in, but it never quite wiped out. You know, I don't think punk or disco, maybe I'm wrong, you can tell me if you were, you know, I wasn't old enough during that era to be aware of exactly what was happening, but it didn't seem like it wiped out hard rock the same way that when grunge showed up, what it did to these hair metal bands. It just, grunge obliterated all these hair metal bands, and you can blame that on the hair metal bands, which I put most of the blame on them, but there's no denying that it was really like almost like an overnight type of thing. I mean, I always tell the story about Kip Winger talking about how they went out on tour. They were playing arenas, then they were playing half-filled arenas a few weeks later, then all the rest of their shows were canceled and the band broke up, and then that was it. You know, for them, they ended up getting back together, but it felt like an overnight type of thing. And I don't know if there's ever been any other type of music that has done that to another style of music, to do this such harsh, quick, and just dropping the guillotine on the whole hair metal scene there. It really just changed everything. Every record exec packed their bags and went to Seattle. And that, and the other thing was too that it was such a contrast to grunge to hair metal. It really brought out the silliness of some of the things, like the way they looked and everything like that. Whereas disco and new wave, they were just like different styles of music, or punk. They weren't necessarily, I guess they did punk sort of highlighted the bloatedness of the long keyboard solos and stuff and of the 70s. But I don't know, it just didn't feel like the way grunge was just like this total opposite of hair metal, and it sort of shined this big bright light on the imperfections, the weaknesses in the world of these LA hair metal bands. All right, number 4 reason for me why hair metal hasn't aged particularly well is just that there's not a lot of depth to a lot of this music, and you could almost say that that's part of the charm to it. It was a time in history when it was about partying and having fun and stuff like this. But when you look back on some of these albums, some of the lyrics, the stuff they were singing about, it wasn't very deep. You know, it was basically just partying and girls and boozing and stuff like that. You know, There's other bands that have made long careers out of that, like AC/DC, but for some reason with the hair metal stuff, it hasn't aged particularly well, and some of the stuff, it's almost cringe-worthy, some of the stuff now. And when you factor in how important MTV was to this stuff, we talked about the look earlier, the look sort of got them on MTV, and MTV sort of fed this desire for them to look outrageous. But the videos and everything, you see it now, and a lot of it is really cringe-worthy. It's not very deep, a lot of this stuff. You know, you're not getting stuff like Stairway to Heaven or, you know, this isn't, you know, Geezer Butler lyrics like in Black Sabbath, and, you know, or just the clever lyrics of you know, in UFO and stuff like that, or Phil Lynott's, you know, amazing storytelling. You know, you're not getting that kind of deep kind of stuff. And you could say, well, maybe that's a strength of hair metal. Sometimes I put it on and it reminds me of more innocent times where it was just about having fun and everything. But some of that stuff has not helped it age very well. I think if there was some stuff that was a little bit deeper, you know, there are no sort of dark side of the moon during for these hair metal bands. And maybe if there was more of that, I think some bands tried to do that. Bands like Tesla, bands like Cinderella, they tried to be a little bit deeper than your typical just partying on the Sunset Strip type of stuff. Even Guns N' Roses, to a degree, tried to change that, but still a lot of their lyrics have aged very poorly. You know, it's very juvenile and stuff, and you know, that is part of rock and roll, but for some reason with the hair metal stuff, some of it has not aged particularly well. And a lot of these bands became very money motivated. Not that bands throughout history before this, the 70s or afterwards, weren't motivated by making money, but at this time, because of MTV, like I mentioned earlier, and because there were a lot of bands getting signed with this type of thing, just bands were doing whatever they needed to do to just get signed, and the labels were signing these bands by the dozens, and it was all pretty shallow. People were just... this hair metal book I'm reading, they're talking, one of the chapters was on ballads, and these guys just admit, it was like, okay, we can make money on a ballad, so they just put these things on these albums. It wasn't sincere. They were doing things just to get attention and get on MTV and stuff like that, and it was, well, maybe more money driven. It wasn't as artistically driven as maybe music was before this. And I think that hurt it in a lot of ways. It hasn't, again, it hasn't aged very well. It showed up in the music. It showed up in the songs, which some of this stuff has dated itself pretty badly. And that would be my last point, that it just, it hasn't always, all these things have caused it to not age very well. And it's sort of stuck. Whereas a band like Led Zeppelin, a song like Stairway to Heaven, a song like Highway Star, or Doctor Doctor, or The Boys Are Back in Town, has a timeless quality to it for me. Like it even though you can tell it's from the 70s, it doesn't sound dated to me, at least. You know, to me, those songs have a timeless quality, and I think it's a testament that they still get played on the radio, you know, to this day. Rush, Tom Sawyer, you know, things like that. But a lot of these bands, the production, the album covers, the lyrics, the look, the whole packaging, it was so tied into the 80s that it hasn't aged well. It's like disco. Disco was a real late 70s thing, and it's fun to look back on it, but it dates itself incredibly. The music, the production of it, the lyric themes, all that stuff is just sort of like it's stuck in a time capsule. And I think that has happened to a lot of the hair metal bands, that it just has caused them to sort of be really stuck in sort of this 80s thing, and it just hasn't aged real well. It doesn't really, a lot of it doesn't have a very timeless quality to me, like the classics that I mentioned there from the 70s. So, all right, there you go. And it's not going to seem like I'm, you know, coming down on hair metal, because I really love hair metal. I grew up on that. I've talked about how that was right when I was a teenager. And a lot of those bands, I really, really like them. And some of those albums are some of my favorite albums. But again, it's when I sort of looked at the whole scene in general. There's bands that stood out above everybody else, Rat, Motley, Dokken. But there's just so many bands around that haven't done particularly well, that haven't aged particularly well, and I thought it would be fun to just sort of throw it out there why I think hair metal hasn't aged very well. All right, so let me know in the comments down below what you guys think. Maybe you completely disagree with me. Maybe you think hair metal, the LA metal stuff, is timeless. If you do, let me know. Let me know why. If you think it hasn't aged very well, let me know in the comments down below what you think of my reasons, and if you have some other reasons why it hasn't aged well for you, throw it in the comments down below. Hit like and subscribe, and until we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.